Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a medieval winter. Not the romantic kind with snow-dusted castles and roaring fireplaces. The real kind. The kind where a wooden hut, barely more than stacked logs and hope, was all that stood between you and death. You're a villager in 14th century England. Outside, the wind howls like something alive and hungry. Inside, you huddle with your family in a space smaller than a modern studio apartment. The walls are rough timber, chinked with whatever you could find. Moss, clay, animal dung mixed with straw. Yes, dung. We'll get to that. Your floor is packed earth, covered with rushes that haven't been changed in weeks. The ceiling is low enough that your father has to stoop. And there's smoke. Always smoke. Because the fire that keeps you alive also fills your lungs with a gray haze that never quite clears. This is survival. Raw, uncomfortable, and absolutely fascinating. Historians estimate that a poorly maintained hut could lose enough heat to drop indoor temperatures below freezing, even with a fire burning. The difference between a well-sealed hut and a drafty one? That was the difference between waking up and not waking up at all. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing this community spread across the globe, all of us drifting off to the same stories. Now, here's something delightfully weird. Some villagers believe that hanging a horseshoe above the door didn't just bring luck, it actually trapped cold air. Eccentric? Absolutely. But when you're desperate, even superstition feels like action. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants fully understood heat retention or simply followed trial-and-error traditions passed down through generations. The answer is probably both. Your family didn't have thermometers or insulation guides. You had grandma's advice and a memory of which neighbors didn't survive last winter. That wooden wall between you and the elements? It was built by hand, often by people who never had formal training in carpentry. Yet these structures stood for decades sometimes. Think about that. No power tools, no Home Depot, just axes, adzes, and the knowledge that mistakes had consequences measured in frozen bodies. The logs were typically oak or elm, chosen for their density. They were fitted together with surprising precision, considering the technology. Gaps were inevitable, though, and those gaps were where winter crept in like a thief. You'd stuff them with whatever was available. Moss worked well because it expanded when wet, creating a tighter seal. Clay mixed with straw was another favorite, though it cracked in extreme cold. And yes, animal dung. Mixed with mud and straw, it dried into a surprisingly effective sealant. Your modern sensibilities might recoil, but medieval you didn't have the luxury of disgust. You had pragmatism. The roof was thatch, bundled reeds, or straw laid in overlapping rows. When properly maintained, thatch could last 20 years and provided decent insulation. When neglected, it became a soggy, dripping liability. Remember that detail about thatch. We'll come back to it when things go wrong. Inside your hut, everything you owned fit into this single room. A table, maybe a few stools, cooking pots hanging from the rafters, dried herbs if you were lucky. And in the corner, the sleeping area, which wasn't really separate at all. Just a section of floor with extra straw and whatever blankets your family possessed. This is where you'll spend the next 4 months. 16 hours of darkness each day. Limited movement. Limited food. Just you, your family, and the constant awareness that the cold is waiting. Always waiting. But the worst was still to come. You can feel it even now, centuries later. That creeping panic as the days shortened and the first frost touched the morning grass. Every village family knew the calendar without needing to read one. When the harvest ended, the real work began. You had perhaps 6 weeks, maybe 8 if the weather held, to prepare your hut for the siege that was coming. First, the roof. You'd climb up there with your father, testing each section of thatch with careful hands, looking for rot, for thin spots, for places where rain had penetrated. A leak in winter wasn't just inconvenient. It was potentially fatal. Water dripping onto your sleeping family could lead to hypothermia. Wet bedding in freezing temperatures meant pneumonia. And pneumonia, in the 14th century, meant death more often than not. So you replaced bad sections, bundled new reeds tightly, overlapping them in the traditional way your grandfather had taught your father. Each layer sloped to shed water and snow. The pitch had to be steep enough, historians suggest around 45 degrees, to prevent snow accumulation that could collapse the entire structure. Some villagers lost their homes every winter to snow weight. Just woke up to cracking beams, and suddenly the sky was falling in. Literally. Next came the walls. You'd walk around the entire hut with your mother, examining every gap, every crack. She had an eye for it, honed by experience. There, she'd point. And there, that one will whistle when a north wind comes. You'd gather moss from the forest floor. Damp moss, preferably, because it would expand as it dried in the gaps. Pack it in with a stick, pushing deep, making sure no air could slip through. Then came the clay mixture. Clay from the riverbank, mixed with chopped straw and, yes, manure. The animals provided that particular ingredient freely. You'd work it like dough, adding water until it reached the right consistency. Not too wet, or it wouldn't stick. Not too dry, or it would crumble before it set. This was folk engineering at its finest. No one had written down the ratios. You learned by watching, by doing, by remembering which mixtures had failed last year. Here's something fascinating. Archaeological evidence from preserved medieval huts shows that some families added animal hair to their wall sealant. Sheep's wool, horsehair, even human hair. It acted as a binding agent, like rebar and concrete. Clever, right? Historians still argue whether this was a widespread practice or limited to wealthier peasants who had access to more materials. The answer probably varied by region and by family wealth. Inside the hut, you'd reinforce the shutters. These weren't glass windows. Glass was for churches and manor houses. You had wooden shutters that covered openings in the walls. In summer, you left them open for light and air. In winter, they stayed closed for months. You'd add extra leather hinges if you had them. Check that they sealed tightly against the frame. Some families hung old blankets or animal hides on the inside for extra insulation. Every little barrier helped. The door got special attention. It was usually made from vertical planks held together with horizontal crosspieces. Heavy, crude, but functional. You'd pack the edges with rope or cloth, anything to stop the draft that would otherwise howl through. Some families hung a curtain of thick wool just inside the door. A sort of airlock, medieval style. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from ancient Egypt? This is the medieval equivalent, using whatever worked, regardless of how odd it seemed. Then came the wood supply. This was critical. Life or death critical. You needed enough firewood to last 4 months of constant burning. Do the math. A fire burning day and night, feeding it every few hours. That's an enormous amount of wood. Your father and older brothers would spend weeks in the forest. Cutting, hauling, stacking. Deadwood was best. It burned cleaner and was already dry. But you couldn't be picky. You took what you could get and hoped it would be enough. The woodpile needed protection from snow and rain. You'd stack it against the side of the hut, covered with old thatch or bark. Wet wood doesn't burn well. It smokes terribly and provides little heat. Running out of dry wood in January meant choices no one wanted to make. Burn your furniture? Your tools? Some families faced exactly that decision. Food storage came next, but we'll explore that delicious topic in a later section. For now, just know that every corner of your hut was being stuffed with supplies. Dried peas hanging in sacks from the rafters. Turnips buried in sand in the corner. Salted pork wrapped in cloth. The hut was transforming from living space into survival bunker. Here's an eccentric detail. Some villagers would deliberately encourage spiders to nest in the rafters before winter. The webs caught flies and mosquitoes that bred in the straw flooring. Fewer insects meant slightly more comfort during the long confinement. Medieval pest control, courtesy of 8-legged roommates. Your mother would prepare the sleeping area with extra care, adding fresh straw, layering whatever blankets the family owned, checking for mouse holes, and blocking them. Mice in the winter stores could mean starvation by February. Every detail mattered. Every small preparation could be the difference between survival and tragedy. And then, one morning, you'd wake to find frost on the inside of the shutters. The race was over. Winter had arrived. And you could only hope you'd done enough. Not just a fire pit, not just a heat source. It was the beating heart of your survival. Without it, your family would freeze within hours. With it, carefully managed, you might see spring. The hearth sat in the center of your hut's floor. A shallow depression, maybe a foot deep, lined with stones if you were fortunate. Just packed clay if you weren't. The fire burned there constantly from October to March. Day and night, night and day. Someone always had to tend it. Your mother mostly, though everyone took turns through the endless dark hours. Let it die, and restarting it was a nightmare. Flint and steel could take half an hour of striking in cold, damp conditions. Your hands would go numb. Your patience would crack. And every moment without fire was a moment losing precious heat. So the fire never died. Not if you could help it. You banked it at night, covering the coals with ash to slow the burn. Then fed it back to life at first light. This rhythm became as natural as breathing. The smoke was constant and inescapable. There was no proper chimney in your hut, just a hole in the roof directly above the hearth. The smoke rose, mostly, and escaped through that opening. But mostly wasn't entirely. Your hut was perpetually hazy. Your eyes stung. Your throat scratched. The walls were black with soot, and so was the underside of your thatch. Historians studying preserved medieval buildings have found soot deposits several inches thick. Your lungs were probably in terrible shape, though you'd never know to call it that. You just accepted the cough that everyone had. Here's something grimly fascinating. The constant smoke actually helped preserve the thatch. It dried it out, prevented rot, and discouraged insects. Your roof lasted longer because you were essentially smoking it like meat. Unintentional preservation through daily suffering. Medieval life had a way of turning misery into marginal advantage. The fire provided heat, obviously, but in a space as small as your hut, managing that heat was an art form. Too close to the fire, and you'd be sweating while your back froze. Too far, and you might as well be outside. Your family arranged itself in a careful circle around the hearth. Father closest, as the head of household. Mother next to him, because she did most of the cooking. Children in order of age. Grandparents, if they were still alive, in the warmest spots. Everyone knew their place, and changing position required negotiation. Think of it as medieval Tetris, but with hypothermia as the penalty for poor arrangement. The hearth was also your kitchen. Every meal was prepared over that same fire. A pot hung from an iron hook attached to a wooden beam above. Pottage, that thick stew of whatever you had, bubbled there for hours. Sometimes days. You'd just keep adding to it, a never-ending meal that evolved with whatever ingredients remained. The pot rarely left the fire from November to March. Cleaning it thoroughly would mean extinguishing the flames. So you rinsed it out occasionally and called it good enough. Medieval food safety was flexible. At night, the fire provided the only light. Candles were expensive, made from tallow that you'd rather eat than burn. So you lived by firelight. Flickering, unreliable, casting wild shadows on the walls. It was enough to see faces, but not enough to read by. Not that most villagers could read anyway. Historians still argue whether the constant dim light contributed to vision problems or whether medieval eyes simply adapted to lower light levels than ours tolerate. Probably both, depending on the individual. The fire was also your social center. Where else would you gather in a one-room hut? Stories were told around the hearth. Songs sung. Arguments had. Your entire family life revolved around that small circle of warmth. When neighbors visited, rare in deep winter, but not unheard of, they were welcomed to the fireside. Given the warmest seat if they were elderly or sick. Offered whatever was in the pot. The hearth made you human, not just surviving animals hiding from the cold. Here's an eccentric detail that'll make you smile. Some families kept a special fire log, burning from Christmas to Twelfth Night. They believed it brought good luck and prevented evil spirits from entering through the smoke hole. The log was usually oak, cut to fit the hearth, and kept smoldering for 12 days straight. Superstition? Absolutely. But also a reason to celebrate and a marker in the endless winter darkness. Something to look forward to, even if it was just a burning log with mystical properties you'd invented. Managing the wood supply was a constant calculation. Burn too much and you'd run out before spring. Burn too little and you'd freeze. Your father watched the woodpile like a merchant watching his gold, counting logs, measuring days, doing math in his head that meant life or death. On the coldest nights, you burn more. You had to. When the wind howled and frost formed inside the walls, you couldn't be stingy. But each extra log was one less for February, traditionally the cruelest month. Some families ran out. You'd hear about it in spring. The Smiths burned their table in January. The Millers didn't make it all. These weren't abstract tragedies. These were people you knew, and their frozen bodies were a reminder that the hearth's hunger never ended. But when managed well, when tended with care and respect, the hearth kept you alive. It cooked your food, warmed your body, lit your darkness, and gave you a place to gather. Everything you had depended on that small fire, that fragile barrier between human and frozen corpse. Remember this hearth. We'll return to it when things get difficult. You shared your home with animals, not as a quaint pastoral choice, as an absolute necessity. When the first hard freeze arrived, you brought them inside. All of them. The cow, if your family was prosperous enough to own one. The pigs, grunting and rooting. Chickens, flapping and squawking. Maybe a goat. Sometimes sheep, though they were often kept in a separate shelter if the village had common resources. They lived in your hut for the entire winter. Yes, in the same space where you slept and ate. The same room where your family spent 16 hours a day in darkness. Imagine the smell. Actually don't. Your modern nose isn't prepared. But medieval, you didn't have the luxury of disgust. You had survival math, and the equation was brutally simple. Animals generate heat. Heat keeps you alive. Therefore, animals stay. The livestock section was usually on the far end of the hut from the hearth, sometimes separated by a low wicker fence or a few boards. Not a wall, though. Never a solid wall, because you wanted their warmth to mix with yours. A cow's body temperature is around 101 degrees Fahrenheit. That massive animal was essentially a walking, mooing furnace. At night, when the fire burned low, that radiant heat made the difference. Historians estimate that livestock could raise the interior temperature of a medieval hut by 5 to 10 degrees. That might not sound like much, but it's the difference between 25 degrees and 35 degrees, between water freezing in your bucket and staying liquid, between frostbite and merely being miserably cold. The animals benefited too, obviously. Outside, they would freeze or starve. Inside, they had shelter from wind and snow. They ate hay that you'd store in the rafters. You could smell it mixed with the smoke and manure. Fresh hay dropped down as needed, landing in their area with a soft thump. The chickens were particularly useful in this arrangement. They roost in boxes or on beams above the animal section. Their body heat rose, warm air does that, and helped heat the whole space. Plus, they laid eggs through winter if kept warm enough. Protein, when everything else was dried or salted or gone. A fresh egg in January was a minor miracle. Your mother would ration them carefully, mixing them into the pottage to make it richer. The pigs were challenging. They're intelligent animals, easily bored, and prone to mischief when confined. You'd hear them rooting around at night, snuffling in the straw. Sometimes they'd escape their section and investigate the human side. Wake up to a pig's snout in your face. It happened more often than you'd think. Here's something delightfully odd. Some families swore that pigs could predict weather changes. If the pigs became restless, a storm was coming. If they burrowed deep into their straw, expect the coldest night yet. Folklore or genuine animal sensitivity to atmospheric pressure. Historians still argue whether these observations had merit or were just confirmation bias from desperate people seeking patterns in chaos. Probably a bit of both. The manure situation was exactly what you're imagining. The animals defecated constantly. You couldn't exactly house train a cow. The manure accumulated in their section, mixed with soiled straw and hay. You'd shovel it out periodically, opening the door just long enough to toss it outside into a growing pile. But you couldn't do this too often. Every door opening meant precious heat escaping. So you lived with the smell. Your nose adapted somewhat, the same way you adapted to the constant smoke. Your clothes absorbed the odor, your hair, your skin. Everyone smelled like animals and smoke and unwashed bodies. But everyone smelled that way, so no one noticed. The modern concept of fresh air didn't exist. Air was either freezing death outside or warm survival inside. You chose survival. The accumulated manure actually had a positive side effect. It generated heat as it decomposed. Microbial action, though medieval you would never have called it that. You just knew that the manure pile stayed warm and seemed to help heat the space. Literal ship-powered heating. Medieval ingenuity at its finest. At night, you could hear the animals breathing. The cows' deep, rhythmic exhalations. The pigs' snuffling snores. Chickens occasionally clucking in their sleep. It was oddly comforting. You weren't alone in the darkness. Other living things shared your confinement, your struggle, your desperate wait for spring. Sometimes children would sleep near the cow for extra warmth, curled up against her massive flank, using her bulk as a windbreak. The cow, patient and resigned, would tolerate these small humans. She had nowhere else to go either. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? This is the medieval version, using what nature provided, no matter how unglamorous. The animals needed water, which was its own challenge. You'd melt snow in a bucket by the fire, then carry it to their section. They'd drink it quickly, their breath steaming in the cold air. Keeping them hydrated meant constant work, but livestock that died from dehydration were livestock that couldn't provide heat or spring labor. You protected your investments, even when those investments pooped on your floor. Disease was a constant worry. Animals and humans, in close quarters, sharing air and space. Illnesses jumped between species more easily than anyone understood. You didn't know about pathogens or vectors. You just knew that sometimes the chickens got sick and then the children got sick. Sometimes everyone survived. Sometimes they didn't. You burned herbs when you could, hoping the smoke would purify the air. It didn't medically speaking, but it made the place smell slightly better, which was something. By late February, the animal section was ankle-deep in compressed manure and soiled straw. The smell was beyond description. You'd count the days until you could finally clean it out properly. But you'd also know that without these animals, their warmth, their eggs, their milk if you had a cow, your family wouldn't have survived. They were partners in misery, cellmates in a wooden prison you'd built yourselves. And when spring finally came and you could open the door for good, you'd lead them back outside with genuine affection. They'd saved your life, even if they'd made you smell terrible doing it. Food in winter was a carefully calculated gamble. You'd preserved what you could in autumn. Now you rationed what remained and hoped it lasted until spring. There was no grocery store down the road, no delivery service, no backup plan. What you had in October was what you'd eat until March. Maybe April if winter lingered, which it often did. The math was simple and terrifying. Your family needed roughly 2,000 calories per person per day to survive. Multiply that by 4 months, by however many mouths you had to feed. That's a staggering amount of food to preserve without refrigeration. Most families came up short. Not catastrophically, you wouldn't starve outright, but you'd be constantly, gnawingly hungry. That hollowed-out feeling became normal. Your body adapted, slowing down, conserving energy. You moved less, thought more slowly. This was survival mode, biological and brutal. Grain was the foundation of everything. Rye, barley, oats, wheat if you were fortunate, though that was usually reserved for the Lord's table. You'd stored it in sacks hung from the rafters, away from the dampness and the mice, though the mice still found it sometimes. You'd wake to the sound of gnawing and know you'd lost another precious handful. The grain got ground in a flour as needed. Your mother used a hand quern, 2 stone discs that she'd turned for hours, crushing grain between them. Exhausting work that left her arms aching. The flour went into bread if you had enough fuel to bake. More often, it went into pottage, that eternal pot hanging over the hearth. Pottage was everything. It was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. A thick stew that started with water, grain, and whatever else you had. Dried peas or beans if your stores held out. Onions from the braided strings hanging on the wall. Turnips or parsnips from the sand-filled corner where root vegetables stayed relatively fresh. Cabbage, if any remained from the autumn salting. A piece of salted pork for flavor, though the meat itself was used sparingly. You'd simmer it for hours, the smell mixing with the smoke and the animal odors. By midwinter, pottage became a sort of continuously evolving meal. You never emptied the pot completely, just added new ingredients to what remained, building layers of flavor over days or weeks. Modern food safety inspectors would have a collective heart attack, but medieval stomachs were tougher, adapted to bacteria and preservation methods that would horrify us. Here's something fascinating. Historians have found evidence that some families added tree bark to their pottage during lean times. Specifically, the inner bark of elm or pine ground into powder. It provided fiber and bulk, making the meal feel more substantial even when calories were scarce. Not nutritious in any real sense, but it filled empty bellies. Desperation cooking at its most inventive. Salted meat hung from the rafters in cloth bundles. Pork mostly, since pigs were easier to keep than cattle. The salt preserved it, drawing out moisture that would otherwise breed decay. You'd cut off small pieces as needed, soaking them first to remove some of the overwhelming saltiness. Then into the pot they'd go. By February, the meat would be rock hard and required hours of boiling to become remotely edible. But it was protein, and protein kept your muscles from wasting entirely. Cheese was a treasure. If you had a cow, you made cheese in autumn, hard wheels that could last months. They aged in the coolest part of the hut, developing a rind that you'd cut away before eating. A small piece of cheese could make an entire pot of pottage feel like a feast. The sharp, tangy flavor cut through the monotony of bland grain and root vegetables. Children would beg for extra cheese, and parents would calculate whether they could spare it. Eggs from the indoor chickens were rationed like gold. One egg split between 4 people, mixed in a pottage or made into a thin scramble. You savored every bite, knowing the next one might be days away. The chickens didn't lay consistently in winter, even indoors. Sometimes you'd go weeks without a single egg. Then suddenly, a bounty of 3 in one day. You never knew, and the uncertainty was maddening. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants understood the relationship between chicken nutrition and egg production, or whether they simply accepted the mystery of intermittent eggs as part of winter's cruelty. Probably they noticed that better-fed chickens laid more, but lacked the resources to act on that knowledge. Dried fish if you lived near water and had been able to trade for it. Cod or herring, preserved in salt or smoke, tough as leather. You'd reconstitute it in water overnight, then add it to the pottage. It provided a different flavor profile and crucial nutrients that land-based food lacked. Coastal villagers had an advantage here. Inland families might never taste fish all winter. Apples, if you'd stored them correctly, wrapped individually in straw and kept in the coolest, driest spot. They'd shrivel and wrinkle, but remained edible for months. A wrinkled apple in January was a luxury. Sweet, tart, crisp against the endless soft mushiness of boiled vegetables. Children's eyes would light up when mother produced apples. A rare treat in the grinding monotony. Here's an eccentric detail that'll surprise you. Some families deliberately made their food boring. Adding variety meant using more of your precious spices and flavoring agents. Monotonous food was actually a preservation strategy. If meals were bland and repetitive, you'd eat only what you needed rather than overeating because something tasted good. Psychological rationing through culinary depression. Medieval diet culture in the grimmest possible way. Wild foods supplemented stores when possible. On milder days, someone might venture out to collect rose hips or hawthorn berries, still clinging to winter bare branches. These provided vitamin C, though you'd never call it that. You just knew that certain foods kept you healthier. Acorns could be leached of bitterness and ground into flour. Labor-intensive, but calories were calories. By late February, you'd be scraping the bottom of every container. The grain sacks hung limp and nearly empty. The salted pork was down to a few pieces. Root vegetables were sprouting in their sand pile, energy they should have been saving for you, going into growth instead. You'd eat them anyway, sprouts and all. This was the hungry time, the time when you understood, viscerally, what starving season meant. Not starvation as in death, though that happened too, but the slow, grinding were of not quite enough food. Every day, every meal, your body consuming itself to stay warm and alive, waiting for the thaw that seemed like it would never come. But it would come. You had to believe that. And in the meantime, you ate your pottage and counted your remaining supplies and did the math over and over, hoping you'd calculated correctly back in October, hoping spring would arrive before the last sack emptied. Sleeping in winter was its own survival strategy. You didn't just lie down and drift off. You prepared. You layered. You huddled. Every aspect of sleep was designed to conserve heat and survive until morning. The sleeping area wasn't a separate room. There were no bedrooms in a one-room hut, just a section of floor, usually the farthest corner from the door, slightly elevated if your family had the resources to build a platform, just packed earth covered with extra straw if you didn't. The bed was whatever you could pile between your body and the frozen ground. First, a thick layer of straw or hay, fresh in autumn, gradually compressing and getting rank as winter progressed. You'd fluff it up occasionally, try to restore some insulation. But by February, it was a compressed mat that smelled of sweat and bodies. On top of the straw, you might have a straw-filled mattress if you were relatively prosperous. A large cloth sack stuffed with dry grass or straw, sewn shut. It provided a bit more comfort and a barrier between you and the floor's chill. Most families shared one or two of these mattresses at most. Blankets were precious beyond measure. Wool, if you had sheep or could trade for it. Heavy, scratchy, and absolutely essential. Each blanket represented months of work. Shearing, washing, carding, spinning, weaving. Your family might own 3 or 4 blankets total. Maybe a fur or 2 if you were fortunate enough to trap or trade for them. These weren't decorative. These were survival equipment. Animal pelts worked beautifully as blankets. Sheepskin with the wool still attached was ideal, warm, relatively soft, naturally water-resistant. Rabbit pelts sewn together made lighter but still effective coverings. Even cat or dog pelts weren't wasted if the animal died. You used everything, wasted nothing. The sleeping arrangement was carefully orchestrated. Everyone slept together in one large pile. Not for coziness, though that was a side effect. For heat conservation. Your family was a biological heating unit, and clustering maximized efficiency. The youngest children slept in the middle, surrounded by adult bodies. They lost heat fastest due to their size, so they got the warmest spot. Parents on either side, creating a protective heat barrier. Older children on the edges, and they'd better not complain about it. Grandparents, if still alive, often slept closest to the animals. That radiant heat from the cow helped their old bones through the night. Plus, if someone died in their sleep, which happened, it was better discovered quickly. Grim, but practical. Everyone slept fully clothed. You wore the same wool tunic and hose you'd worn all day. Removing clothing meant losing heat, and you had none to spare. Your clothes were your inner insulation layer. The blankets went over everyone at once. One large covering tucked around the edges, trapping heat underneath. You'd pile them on, every blanket, every pelt, everything you owned. The weight was substantial, comforting in its own way. Heavy covers pressing down, holding in warmth. Here's something fascinating. Historians have found evidence that some families sewed their blankets together at the edges during winter, creating essentially a large sleeping bag that enclosed everyone. The opening could be cinched shut, minimizing heat loss. In the morning, you'd open it, and everyone would emerge like puppies from a den. Shared breath under those blankets created a warm, humid microclimate. Not pleasant, exactly. The air was stale and full of everyone's exhalations, but warm. And warmth trumped comfort every single time. You breathed in your family's breath all night, and they breathed in yours. Intimacy forced by survival. Sometimes you'd heat stones by the fire before bed. Wrap them in cloth and tuck them near your feet. They'd stay warm for hours, and cold feet were one of winter's special miseries. Historians still argue whether this practice was widespread or limited to wealthier families who had spare cloth for wrapping hot stones. Evidence exists in both folktales and archaeological finds of fire-cracked stones near sleeping areas. So probably common, at least among families with enough foresight to plan ahead. The downside of communal sleeping was obvious. No privacy, no personal space. If someone snored, everyone heard it. If a child wet the bed, and in the cold, bladders were unreliable, everyone dealt with it. If you were sick, you infected everyone. Lice and fleas moved freely between bodies in the close quarters. You'd wake up itching, and so would everyone else. But you'd also wake up alive. Which was the point? Getting up in the night to relieve yourself was an ordeal. You'd have to disturb everyone, extracting yourself from the pile. The cold would hit you like a physical blow. You'd stumble to the corner where a bucket served as a chamber pot. Do your business quickly, shivering violently. Then rush back to the sleeping pile, trying to reclaim your warm spot. Your family would grumble, but make room. Everyone understood. Everyone had to do it eventually. Some nights were worse than others. When the wind howled and the fire burned low, you could feel the cold creeping in. It found every gap in the blankets, every exposed bit of skin. You'd pull in tighter, huddle closer, press against your siblings or parents, sharing body heat in the most literal way possible. On the worst nights, you'd hear the timber walls creaking from the cold, the thatch crackling with frost. Outside, the world was trying to kill you. Inside, you were warm enough to survive. Barely, but enough. Morning came late in winter. 16 hours of darkness meant sleeping longer simply because there was nothing else to do. You'd wake to gray light filtering through the smoke hole. Someone, usually your mother, would already be up, coaxing the banked fire back to life. The cold would be shocking as you emerged from the blanket pile, your breath visible in the air, your fingers stiff and clumsy. But you'd survived another night, and that's what mattered. Remember that sleeping arrangement. Remember the pile of bodies under the pile of blankets. Because when things went wrong, when illness struck or food ran low, this is where you'd fight your battles. In the dark, in the cold, pressed against the people you loved, hoping dawn would find you all still breathing. Nothing stayed perfect through winter. Your carefully prepared hut faced constant assault from ice, snow, and relentless cold. Maintenance wasn't optional. It was a daily battle against forces that wanted to crush, freeze, or bury you. The thatch was your first vulnerability. Snow accumulated on that sloped roof, pound after silent pound. You couldn't see it happening from inside, but you could feel it. The beams would creak under increasing weight, a subtle groan that made everyone stop and listen. Your father would calculate in his head. How much snow had fallen? How much could the structure bear? At some point, someone had to climb up there. In freezing temperatures, on an icy, slanted surface, and shovel. This was terrifying, dangerous work. One slip meant a fall on a frozen ground. Broken bones in winter were often death sentences. No doctors, no hospitals, no way to heal properly. So you climbed carefully, testing each foothold. Used a wooden shovel or a broom to push snow off the edges. Worked quickly because your hands were going numb. Historians have documented multiple cases of villagers falling from roofs during winter maintenance, with fatal results. It was common enough that villages had informal protocols for caring for families who lost their primary worker to a roof fall. Community support born from shared danger. The weight of snow could also cause the thatch itself to fail. Old sections, weakened by years of smoke and weather, might suddenly collapse inward. You'd be sitting by the fire and suddenly, crash. A section of roof caves in, dumping snow and frozen thatch onto your living space. The fire hisses and steams. The cold rushes in. And now you have an emergency repair situation in the middle of winter. Your father and older brothers would scramble to patch it, using spare thatch from the stores, if you had any. Pieces of old cloth, boards, anything to cover the hole. Working frantically while precious heat escaped into the night sky. This is where autumn preparation paid off or failed spectacularly. Families who'd skimped on roof maintenance paid the price now. Ice was another enemy. It formed on the outside of your walls where moisture from inside met the freezing exterior. The logs would be coated in ice, making the entire structure slick and frozen. Inside, Frost would form on the walls during the coldest nights. You'd wake to find the interior walls covered in a delicate crystalline coating. Beautiful in its way, also alarming. It meant the cold was winning. The gaps in your wall sealant would become obvious in winter. A draft that was barely noticeable in autumn became a howling whistle in January. You'd feel it, a cold knife of air cutting through the warmth. Finding the exact spot required detective work. Someone would walk around with a candle, watching where the flame flickered. Then you'd patch it again. More moss, more clay mixture, though it was harder to work in freezing temperatures. Sometimes you just stuff a rag in the gap and hope it held. The door was a perpetual problem. Wood expands and contracts with temperature changes. Your door, fitted reasonably well in autumn, might swell tight in winter humidity, or it might shrink, leaving new gaps around the edges. You'd adjust the packing, add more cloth or rope, but it was never perfect. Always a compromise. Here's something eccentric that actually worked. Some families would deliberately ice over their doors. Throw water on the door edges and let it freeze, creating an ice seal. Airtight and effective, at least until you needed to open the door. Then you'd have to chip away your own handiwork. Medieval ingenuity meeting medieval inconvenience. The shutters would freeze shut, literally frozen in place by accumulated ice. Not that you wanted them open anyway, but the inability to open them if needed was psychologically difficult. You were sealed in, trapped by ice of your own design. Some families would crack a shutter briefly for fresh air. The smoke could get unbearable, but the blast of cold would send everyone scrambling closer to the fire. Fresh air versus survival warmth. You chose warmth every time. The floor was constantly damp from tracked-in snow, animal waste, and condensation. The packed earth became mud in spots. You'd add more rushes, more straw, trying to keep a dry layer on top. But underneath, it was a soggy, frozen mess. Your feet were always cold and often wet. Chilblains, painful inflammation from cold and moisture, were nearly universal. Your toes would ache and itch and occasionally develop open sores. You just lived with it. Everyone did. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants developed some physiological adaptation to constant cold exposure, or whether they simply had a higher pain tolerance born from necessity. Probably both, plus a hefty dose of no other choice. The hearthstones, if you had them, would crack from thermal stress. Repeated heating and cooling caused them to fracture. You'd hear a sharp crack in the night, another stone split. You'd replace it when possible, but in deep winter, you may do. A cracked hearthstone was still better than no hearthstone. The timber beams overhead would sometimes crack from the extreme cold. A sound like a gunshot in the darkness. Everyone would freeze, listening, waiting to see if the whole structure was coming down. Usually it held. The beam had just released stress. But those moments of terror were regular visitors. Your tools would break. The wooden shovel for cleaning out the animals would crack along the grain. The iron pot hook might snap from metal fatigue. Replacing or repairing these in winter was nearly impossible. You couldn't work iron without a forge, and the village smith might be just as trapped as you. So you improvised, lashed things together, made do with half-broken equipment. Water was a constant challenge. Snow had to be collected and melted, but bringing in snow meant opening the door, heat loss. And melting snow took fuel, which you couldn't spare. You'd calculate carefully, collect a lot at once to minimize door openings. Pack it in buckets near the fire to melt slowly. The resulting water often had debris in it. Bits of thatch, dirt, animal hair. You'd strain it through cloth if you had time and energy. Otherwise, you just drank it and didn't think too hard about it. The animals would sometimes damage the interior structure. A restless cow might rub against a support post until it loosened. Pigs would root at the base of walls, undermining your careful sealant work. You'd repair it, but the damage was cumulative. By spring, your hut would be battered and worn. The question was whether it would last until you could properly repair it. Some structures didn't make it. You'd hear in spring about the Johnsons' hut collapsing in February. They'd survive by crowding into a neighbor's already overcrowded space. Everyone uncomfortable, but everyone alive. That was the goal. Not comfort, not convenience, Just survival until the thaw. And every creak, every crack, every new draft was a reminder that your shelter was temporary. A fragile barrier between you and the frozen void outside. Survival was never a solo act. No single family could make it through winter alone. You needed your neighbors, and they needed you. This wasn't charity or kindness, though those existed too. This was practical necessity wrapped in social obligation. The village operated as an informal insurance system. Everyone contributed what they could when they could. Everyone drew from the collective when they had to. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't fair. But it kept more people alive than the alternative. Your neighbor 3 huts down, old Thomas, lived alone after his wife died 2 winters back. He couldn't manage everything himself anymore. So your father would check on him every few days. Bring him a bit of firewood from your stack. Make sure his fire hadn't died. Ensure he was still breathing and coherent. This wasn't optional generosity. This was village survival protocol. Because next winter, it might be your family needing those check-ins. The youngest children were watched communally. If your mother needed to haul water from the stream on a less frozen day, the neighbor woman would watch her siblings. You'd all crowd into one hut, doubling the chaos but having the risk. No child left alone near a fire. No child wandering outside into deadly cold. The village shared this responsibility without discussion. It was simply how things worked. Food sharing happened more quietly. You wouldn't advertise that you were running low. That was shameful, suggesting poor planning. But a neighbor might mention that her pot of pottage was too much for just us. Could your family help reduce it? Everyone understood the game. You'd accept gratefully, eating the extra meal without acknowledging the charity. Next year, if you had surplus, you'd play the same game in reverse. Historians have documented these informal food-sharing networks through court records and manor documents. When someone died of starvation, investigations often revealed that neighbors had been supplementing their food for weeks. The system wasn't foolproof, but it existed. Firewood sharing was more openly acknowledged. If a family lost their primary woodcutter to illness or accident, the village men would organize. Everyone contributed a small amount from their own stack. A few logs from each household created a life-saving pile for the affected family. You gave reluctantly. Those were your logs, your survival. But you gave, because the village demanded it, and because someday you might be the family in need. Tool sharing was essential. Only a few families owned good iron tools. An axe, a saw, a decent shovel. These were valuable. They circulated through the village on an informal lending system. You'd borrow the smith's axe to split wood, then return it promptly. They'd borrow your grinding stone to sharpen their tools. Everyone depended on everyone else's equipment. Breaking or losing a borrowed tool was a social catastrophe. You'd owe a debt that might take years to repay. So you guarded borrowed items like your life depended on them. Because in a way it did. Here's something beautifully strange. Some villages held midwinter gatherings. Not celebrations exactly, more like communal survival checks. Everyone would crowd into the largest hut, usually belonging to the most prosperous family. You'd bring whatever you could spare, a bit of food, some ale songs. The real purpose was accountability. To see who was struggling, who was missing, to identify families that needed intervention before they died quietly in their huts. It was welfare hidden inside socializing. Medieval social services, rustic but effective. The elderly were particularly vulnerable. They couldn't generate as much body heat, couldn't work to stay warm. Villages that wanted to maintain their collective humanity had to care for them. Old Margaret, who lived at the village edge, would be brought into a younger family's hut for the coldest weeks. She'd sleep with the grandchildren, share their warmth and blankets. In return, she'd watch the children during the day, tell stories, pass down knowledge. An exchange of care that benefited everyone. Historians still argue whether this practice was genuinely widespread or idealized in later accounts. Evidence suggests both. Some villages cared beautifully for their elderly, others let them freeze. Humanity under stress reveals itself in contradictions. Illness in one family became everyone's concern. Not from altruism, from fear. Disease in close quarters spread fast. If the Millers had fever, you'd check on them, but keep your distance. Bring food to their door, leave it outside. Call through the walls to make sure someone was still conscious. If they all died, you'd notify the church and avoid the hut for weeks. If they recovered, you'd welcome them back carefully. This was community care meeting self-preservation. The village priest, if you had one living nearby, served as coordinator. He'd know who was struggling because people confessed their fears. He'd organize help without broadcasting the details. Medieval social work through religious infrastructure. Sometimes it worked beautifully. Sometimes the priest was just as trapped and helpless as everyone else. Children would sometimes be redistributed temporarily. If your family had food, but another family had many mouths and little stores, you might take a child for a few weeks. One more body in your sleeping pile. One more mouth to feed. Yes, but that mouth belonged to your neighbor's daughter. Next year, they might take in your son. The village balanced these human resources constantly, trading children like you'd trade grain, but with more emotion and significantly more complexity. There were limits to communal support, of course. A family that consistently failed to prepare, that squandered resources, would find help drying up. Social pressure enforced responsibility. You helped those who genuinely suffer bad luck. You grudgingly helped those who'd made poor choices, but you remembered. And you let natural consequences teach harsh lessons to those who refuse to learn. It sounds cruel by modern standards. But resources were finite, and unlimited compassion meant everyone died. So the village drew lines, made hard choices, lived with the guilt. Information sharing was crucial. Who'd found a patch of winter berries, still edible? Whose roof had collapsed? What could be learned from their mistake? Which family had illness so you could avoid them? This knowledge circulated through quick conversations when paths crossed, through shouts between huts on less cold days, through children sent as messengers with carefully memorized information. The village functioned as a distributed intelligence network, many eyes watching for danger, many minds solving problems. By late winter, the social bonds were strained. Everyone was tired, hungry, irritable. Petty disputes became major conflicts. Someone's pig escaped and ate your last turnip. Someone borrowed a tool and returned it damaged. Someone's children were too loud and disturbed your rest. These tensions would explode in spring, leading to feuds that lasted years. But during winter, you suppressed the anger. You couldn't afford to alienate your survival network over a turnip. So you swallowed the rage, made tight smiles, waited for spring to settle scores. The village that survived together stayed together. Not always happily, not always fairly, but alive. And when the thaw finally came, when you could open your doors and see your neighbors again in daylight, you'd count who made it, who'd survived the wooden prisons you'd built for yourselves. And you'd begin the slow work of repairing social bonds that winter had damaged. Because next year, you'd need each other again. You always would. The darkness was the hardest part. Not the cold, though that was brutal. Not the hunger, though that gnawed constantly. The darkness. The endless, suffocating darkness. Winter days were short, 8 hours of weak daylight at best. But inside your hut, with shutters closed tight, daylight barely registered. A gray dimness filtering through cracks. Just enough to tell that somewhere outside, the sun existed. Then it would set, early afternoon by your modern reckoning. And the darkness would settle in for another 16 hours. 16 hours. Every single day. For 4 months. Think about that. Your modern life has electric lights, screens, constant stimulation. You probably can't imagine true darkness anymore. But medieval, you lived in it. Moved through it. Breathed it. The fire provided the only reliable light. Flickering, unreliable, creating more shadows than illumination. You could see faces near the hearth clearly enough. Beyond that circle of firelight, your hut dissolved into darkness. You knew your family was there in the shadows. You could hear them breathing, moving, existing. But you couldn't see them. It was profoundly isolating, even when surrounded by people. Candles existed, but they were precious. Made from tallow, rendered animal fat. They smoked terribly and smelled worse. You'd light one only for specific tasks that required steady light. Mending clothes, examining a wound, finding something dropped. Then you'd extinguish it immediately, conserving the resource. Most nights passed in firelight and darkness. The psychological toll was immense. Your body's circadian rhythm depended on light cycles that barely existed. You'd sleep 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours. Not because you were tired, though you were, but because sleeping passed the time. What else was there to do in the darkness? Historians have studied seasonal affective disorder in modern populations and theorized about medieval experiences. Without artificial light or any understanding of mental health, villagers simply endured what they called winter melancholy. Depression by any modern diagnosis. But medieval, you didn't have that vocabulary. You just felt heavy, hopeless, empty, and you waited for spring, wondering if you'd feel human again. Cabin fever wasn't just a modern term. The restlessness, the irritability, the desperate need to move and go anywhere else. Medieval villagers felt all of it. But you couldn't leave. Outside was death. So you paced in the small space, careful not to disturb others. You'd walk circles around the hearth until your family told you'd stop. Then you'd sit, vibrating with unexpressed energy until the feeling passed. It always passed. Eventually, children suffered especially. They needed movement, play, stimulation. Your younger siblings would get fractious, fighting with each other over nothing, crying for no reason, driving everyone to frustration. Your mother would try to occupy them with small tasks, sorting dried beans, untangling yarn, telling stories. But there were only so many stories, and everyone had heard them all multiple times. By February, even the best stories felt hollow. Here's something wonderfully strange. Some families invented elaborate, imaginary games to pass the time. They'd pretend the hearth was a castle, and the sleeping area was the forest. The children would act out quests and adventures in a space smaller than your modern bathroom. Knights fighting invisible dragons. Princesses escaping imaginary towers. Pure imagination as survival tool, keeping young minds occupied so they didn't descend into the same darkness as the adults. Adults had their own coping mechanisms. Carving small objects from wood scraps, mending and remending the same clothes until there was nothing left to mend. Telling stories, yes, but also gossip. Endless discussions of village affairs, neighbors' business, speculation about who'd survive winter. It sounds cruel, and it was. But it was also entertainment in a world without any other options. Some families sang work songs, religious hymns, folk ballads passed down through generations. Singing filled the darkness with something besides silence and breathing. It lifted spirits, at least temporarily, and it reminded you that humans made music, not just survival sounds. You were still human, still capable of creating beauty. Even here, in the smoky darkness, waiting for spring. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants sang more or less than wealthier classes during winter. Records are scarce, but folk song tradition suggests that singing was common and valued. Music as medicine for darkness-induced despair. Some nights, you just sit and watch the fire, stare into the flames for hours. Let your mind drift, unfocused, empty. Medieval meditation, born from boredom and darkness rather than spiritual practice. But it served the same function, quieting the restless mind, accepting the present moment. You had no choice but to be here, now, in this darkness. So you learned to exist in it. The concept of time became fluid. Without daily schedules or clocks, one day blurred into the next. You'd wake up not knowing if it was Tuesday or Saturday. Not that it mattered. Every day was the same. Fire, food, darkness, sleep, repeat. Your mother might keep track of Sundays for religious reasons. Mark them somehow, observe them with extra prayers. But even that distinction faded after weeks of identical days. The waiting was excruciating. Waiting for spring, for warmth, for light, for the chance to open your door and step outside without dying. You'd calculate obsessively. How many days had passed? How many remained? Was this February or still January? The uncertainty was maddening. Some families carved marks on a beam for each passing day, a physical record of survival. Looking at those marks provided strange comfort. This many days endured. This many fewer until spring. Progress, measured in scratches on smoke-blackened wood. Fights were inevitable. Trapped together in darkness, everyone's worst qualities emerged. Father would snap at mother over some trivial thing. Mother would lash out at the children. Siblings would attack each other verbally, sometimes physically. The hut would fill with anger that had nowhere to go. Then, eventually, exhaustion would settle in. Apologies would mumble forth. Or not. Sometimes you just stopped fighting and went back to coexisting. Because what choice did you have? You couldn't leave. Couldn't escape each other. So you'd sit in hostile silence until the anger faded. Then start the cycle again days or weeks later. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen and the shared warmth with pig strategy? This psychological survival was the same principle. Use whatever works, no matter how uncomfortable. Endure what must be endured. Adapt or perish. Religious faith helped many families. Prayers filled time and provided structure. The promise of heaven made earthly suffering more bearable. Your mother would lead evening prayers around the hearth. The familiar words in the darkness, spoken together. A reminder that you weren't alone in the cosmic sense, even if you felt desperately alone in the immediate sense. For some, this was genuine comfort. For others, just another ritual to mark the passing time. But everyone participated because community required it. By late February, a strange calm would sometimes settle. You'd pass through the worst. You'd survive the darkest, coldest part. Spring was coming. You could feel it, sense it, even if you couldn't prove it. The darkness felt less oppressive. Not because it had changed, but because your mind had adapted. You'd learn to exist in it. And soon, you'd emerge. Back into light. Back into movement. Back into being fully human again. You just had to wait a little longer. In the darkness. Always in the darkness. And then, finally it came. The thaw. Not suddenly. Winter never surrendered quickly. But gradually, in small victories that built hope. You'd wake one morning to hear something unfamiliar. Dripping. Water dripping from eaves as ice began to melt. The sound was extraordinary after months of frozen silence. Your mother would pause her fire tending and just listen. Everyone would listen. That drip, drip, drip was the sound of survival confirmed. You'd made it. The sunlight changed first. It came earlier, lasted longer, fell at a different angle through the smoke hole. You could measure it, those few extra minutes each day. Light that felt warmer, even if the temperature hadn't risen much yet. Your father would stand beneath the smoke hole, face tilted up, soaking in the pale sunlight. Vitamin D after months of deficiency, though he'd never call it that. Just warmth. Just light. Just hope. The snow began its slow retreat, melting during the day, refreezing at night, creating treacherous ice. But melting. Definitely melting. You'd see patches of brown earth emerging like promises. Mud, glorious mud, instead of endless white. The village paths became rivers of slush. Your father would venture outside more frequently now, testing conditions, assessing damage, walking to the woodpile without the desperate urgency of January. The supply had lasted, barely but enough. He'd take inventory of what remained and calculate whether you'd need as much next year. Spoiler, you would. You always did. But for now, the crisis had passed. The animals sensed the change too. The cow became restless, wanting outside. The pigs rooted more energetically, anticipating freedom. Even the chickens seemed more animated, clucking with what sounded like optimism. Soon you'd be able to let them out. Clean out the accumulated months of manure. Air out the hut properly. But not yet. Not quite yet. Your mother would finally open the shutters on a milder day. The hinges would protest, frozen and stiff. But they'd open and light, real, direct sunlight, would pour in. The hut's interior would be revealed in harsh detail. Soot-blackened walls. Filthy straw. The stench you'd stopped noticing. It was shocking and wonderful simultaneously. Light. Fresh air. The promise of renewal. The first outside work was tentative. Men would gather in the village center, speaking in loud voices after months of indoor whispers. Comparing notes. Counting survivors. The Smiths lost their grandmother. The Millers lost a child. Old Thomas made it. Surprisingly, those firewood donations had worked. Each family's winter story written in who remained. You begin cleaning in earnest, opening the door wide, finally wide, and shoveling out months of accumulated filth. The manure pile, the soiled straw, everything festering inside. It was disgusting, backbreaking work, and it felt absolutely glorious. Action, movement, purpose beyond mere survival. You were reclaiming your space, preparing for the next season. Being human meant more than huddling around fire. It meant work, progress, building toward something. The women would emerge with bundles of winter clothing. Everything you'd worn for 4 months straight needed washing. The village stream, now flowing again, became a communal laundry. Women scrubbing wool and linen, gossiping, laughing. The sound of normal life resuming. Children would play outside for the first time in months. Running, screaming, burning off accumulated energy. They'd come back muddy and exhausted and radiantly happy. Your little brother's pale winter face would flush with color. His eyes would brighten. His laughter would sound genuine again. Winter had pressed all of you flat. Spring was reinflating your humanity. The food situation remained tight. You'd survived winter, but spring was traditionally lean too. The starving season extended into April sometimes. Last year's stores were exhausted. This year's crops hadn't grown yet, but there were options now. Wild greens emerging in the forest, you'd gather them eagerly. Birds returning, occasionally caught in snares. Fish in the thawing streams. Not abundance, but variety. Fresh food. Hope. Historians documented that many medieval deaths occurred in early spring, not deep winter. Bodies weakened by months of inadequate nutrition, finally failing just as survival seemed certain. The cruelest timing imaginable. Your village would bury those who'd almost made it. Mourn them properly now that the ground was soft enough for graves. And remember them next autumn when preparations began again. The hut itself needed serious repairs. You'd survey the damage with your father. This beam had cracked. That section of thatch had failed. The wall sealant needed complete replacement. The work was endless, but you had time now, and daylight, and warmth. The repairs would take weeks, but they'd happen. The structure that had protected you would be restored, ready for next winter's siege. Some families had to rebuild entirely. Their huts hadn't survived the snow weight or the ice damage. The village would help, everyone contributing labor. Timber cutting, thatching, wall raising. The same communal support that had shared firewood now shared skills and effort. Building homes so everyone had shelter when winter returned. Because winter would return. It always did. The psychological recovery was slower than physical recovery. Weeks after emerging, you'd still feel the weight of those dark months. Still wake up expecting darkness and confinement. The openness of spring felt strange, almost threatening. You'd lived compressed for so long that expansion felt unnatural. But gradually, day by day, you'd adjust. Remember joy. Remember possibility. Remember that life was more than survival. Your mother would plant her garden as soon as the earth permitted, pressing seeds into soil with reverent care. These tiny seeds represented next autumn's preparation. The cycle beginning again, eternal and necessary. She'd pray over them, for growth, for abundance, for enough to get through next winter. Because there would be a next winter. There always was. The village would hold a spring celebration eventually. Simple, humble, you had little to spare for festivities. But songs would be sung, stories shared, ale distributed. You'd celebrate survival, community, endurance, the fact that you'd made it through together. Most of you anyway. And you'd begin the slow work of restoring relationships strained by winter's pressure, forgiving grudges, mending connections, building the social fabric you need next year. Because next year, you do it all again. The preparation, the sealing in, the darkness, the cold, the hunger, the waiting. Medieval life was cyclical. Each winter a test, each spring a reprieve, each year a gamble that you'd calculated correctly. And as you stood in the spring sunshine, warm on your face for the first time in months, you'd make a promise. Next autumn, you'd prepare better. Gather more wood. Seal the walls tighter. Store more food. Make next winter a little more bearable. You'd keep that promise for a few weeks. Then summer would arrive, warm and generous. And you'd forget, just a little, how brutal winter had been. Human memory was merciful that way, softening the edges of trauma so you could face it again. You'd live in the present, planting, growing, harvesting, enjoying warmth and light and freedom, until autumn arrived with its creeping chill. And you'd remember, suddenly and viscerally, what was coming. And you'd begin preparations again, sealing your wooden cocoon, stocking your survival supplies, preparing to retreat into darkness and cold, doing what humans had always done, adapting, enduring, surviving, one winter at a time, one cold night at a time, one drip of melting ice at a time, until spring returned again, as it always had, as it always would. The fire crackles softly now, in this warm space where you're safe. Your blankets are clean and soft. Your home is secure. You're not waiting in darkness for spring. You're here, comfortable, drifting. Those medieval villagers survived their winters, emerged into springs they'd almost stopped believing in. And you'll emerge into tomorrow, rested and renewed. But tonight you can simply be warm, safe, held by comfort they could barely imagine. The struggle is over, the waiting is done. Sleep now, as they finally could when winter released them. Deep sleep, peaceful sleep, the sleep of those who've survived. Let your breathing slow like melting ice. Let your thoughts fade like winter darkness. Let your body rest as there's finally could. In springtime's safety, in gentle warmth, in peace. Sweet dreams.